Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today on the Homebrewed Christianity podcast is a historian of science and religion, the most prominent and influential one around, someone who has had thousands of pages cross my eyes, and now I get to talk to him. That's right, Peter Harrison. It was a blast to get to talk to Peter Harrison, and he has a brand new book that came out in the last few months called Some New World. It's spectacular. It looks at a genealogy, you could say, of miracles, belief, science, religion, these kinds of things. He looks at the genealogy, a historical account of how these concepts changed, and then uses that history to help us think about the kind of divisions or distinctions or walls we put up between topics or ideas or possibilities, and go, hey, maybe it's not reality itself that's rendering these divisions, but an inheritance in our history. And he's a wonderful historian and an excellent communicator about it. So thank you, Dr. Harrison, for coming on. I hope you enjoy this. And over the next month or so, we'll hear a couple more conversations in this vein, looking at the history of science, religion, and how that plays an important role of shaping the context for thinking about faith in the present day. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today I get to talk with Peter Harrison, who I've read quite a few of his books, but today I'm sure I'll ask questions from many of them, but his newest book, Some New World, is quite a barn burner. You know, it arrives just a week or two after Charles Taylor's new book, and y'all two just went right back to back, and it was a lot of fun. But I really appreciate you being here, and been looking forward to getting to talk to you.
Great trip. Yeah, well, look, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Glad you enjoy the book and look forward to talking more.
I first discovered your work when I started my postdoc in science and religion, and was assigned a class to facilitate, and you had been to Edinburgh and recorded some of the lectures for the Intro to Science and Religion class. And
Right.
yeah, it was exciting. I had to answer your questions, so I had to spend the week reading the things that showed up in your footnotes so that I could be, approximating an authority in class.
Wow. Look, I remember recording those lectures and thinking they were pretty dull. So you've done well to sit through them and survive that experience.
Well, I really enjoyed it because my entry, I was a student of Philip Clayton, who does lots in science and religion, but I was doing kind of constructive philosophy of religion, and the science stuff was tangential. And then I get to start working on this philosophy of mind project in Edinburgh and get more and more invested in it. And the larger history of science and religion's relationship, I only knew little bits, and usually the ones, like Whitehead points out in his work in Science in the Modern World and such. But the bigger picture in that history I found really helpful for thinking about a number of the challenges people of faith ask today, and a number of the roadblocks that the scientific community have around kind of unexamined assumptions that scholars in both territories bring.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think history is just a great tool for that. And there's a kind of neutrality to it. If you just lay out the stuff and you do the descriptive work, I think it's a very effective way of getting a handle on some of the contemporary problems. So obviously, and the best side.
If you're starting to try to explain to someone, maybe on a plane or in an elevator,
Right.
just what you do, like, is there
Yeah.
a particular kind of moment in history or some counterintuitive insight that's gained in the big history of science and religion's relationship you use to like give that little window of what your passion is?
Yeah, look, I can talk at length about this, but I think the basic thing is this, that we've inherited this story about the history of science and religion just gets completely wrong. In fact, it gets it the wrong way around. And it turns out that, rather than science and religion historically being involved in this, extended conflict or territory, in fact, for most of the time, they got on well. And I think more than that, the modern sciences themselves in the West are premised upon a set of theological assumptions. So in a nutshell, I think that's the story.
So when did you first, like, decide this historical trajectory at looking at science and religion's relationship, could actually help, kind of reframe the way a bad history shows up in so much religion science dialogue?
Yeah, look, so I mean, in a way, it goes right back to my very first book. And the problem I was thinking about in that context wasn't science and religion at all. It was the problem of religious pluralism, which in essence is, you've got these plural religions. They seem to be asserting different propositional truths about, well, how can they can't all be right. And the possibility is they might all be wrong. That seems to be the way that goes. And so I did my first book was historical work on the concept religion, where I said, that attempted to show that our present idea of religion as, set of beliefs and practices is actually a modern idea. And that the problem of religious pluralism is actually tied up in the concept of religion itself. And if we can relinquish that modern understanding of it, and there are resources in the medieval and patristic periods for thinking about religion in very different ways, if we can relinquish that concept of religion that kind of, to use Wittgenstein's phrase, kind of holds us captive, it actually ameliorates this problem of religious pluralism to some degree. So that then was the principle that I used many years later for science and religion, revisiting that old material about how the concept of religion emerges in the West, but pairing that with a story about how the concept of science emerges. And, the basic line here is that these concepts are not given, they're not out there in the world, they're historical developments specific to the Western sphere. And they actually constrain the ways we think about science and religion. And it's those constraints that give rise to these historical mythologies. And so once we can once we understand the historical emergence of the concepts themselves, then we're in a position to illuminate contemporary problems about how these things are supposed to relate to each other, which turn out to be artifacts of the concepts and not kind of real, in a way, just to oversimplify.
Perhaps you can take us back to uh, the the way in which, the modern conflict narrative first emerges. Because I think that there's this energy or inertia to it, that sabotages all sorts of really constructive interdisciplinary work, because so many people, both within the guild and without, have kind of rendered the conflict narrative final.
Yeah, yeah. So look, as in many things historical, there are lots of places we can trace the origin to. And look, most historians of science talk about the late 19th century, and they tend to identify two specific texts that really epitomize this conflict story. And so the conflict story, in a sense, is invented in the 19th century by figures like John William Draper, who was an Anglo-American chemist and turned his hand to history. Andrew Dixon White, who was the first president of Cornell University. These guys wrote very influential books that argue that there was a long history of conflict between science and religion. And these books were enormously popular. They were translated in many languages and they saturated, I think, our intellectual world telling this conflict story. And, there are plausible elements to the story, most famously, I think, the Galileo story, which epitomized this idea of conflict. In the book Some New World, I argue that this conflict story actually has deeper historical roots. And if you go back to the Protestant Reformation, in a way, Protestant critiques of Catholicism, critiquing Catholicism as superstitious, and then Protestant apologists subsequently appealing to the Galileo affair as evidence that Catholicism was anti-science. So Protestant polemics actually give us the origins of this conflict. And what happens in the 18th century is that Enlightenment thinkers just generalized this Protestant story to apply to all of religion. Now, you still see traces of the origin in say, John Draper's history of the conflict with science. Draper says, look, actually, the problem's not so much Protestantism, it's really Catholicism. But again, in Andrew Dixon White, we get a much more generalized version of this and say that the Protestant story about Catholicism representing sort of superstition and anti-science, which is completely false, by the way. But nonetheless, that Protestant story gets generalized by Enlightenment thinkers. And then in the 19th century, you get these very detailed histories that give a kind of blow-by-blow with these putative historical instances of science and religion. And that becomes part of the modern mythology.
Yeah, I think there's a couple elements in it that I found like really are really helpful, and maybe we can kind of pause on them, and you can share whatever whatever comes up. But prior to the Protestant period, you had this, the tradition of the two books, like the Book of Nature and the Book of Scripture, and obviously, when you look at nature with the metaphor of a book, that raises the question of hermeneutics, and something that you've spent quite a bit of time on is looking at the way in which the modern biblical scholarship and the way it transforms Protestantism ultimately sets up for transforming how we engage and read the world hermeneutically. So I'd love for you to take some time to tell a bit of that narrative, because I mean it kind of blew my mind, and I didn't know that kind of really bad scientism initially began with biblical scholars. That was
Yeah.
not on my agenda.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two phases in the biblical scholarship. And I think one is the demise of emblematic readings and allegorical readings. The other is the emergence of modern German biblical criticism, which has a major impact in the 19th century. But look, to go back to the first one, I think if we look at medieval reading practices, and I think, Augustine or going back even further, Origen's, hermeneutical approach is essentially that we read nature and scripture together. So the two books, it's not that they're completely separate. On the contrary, the scripture actually provides us with a key to the meanings of things in the natural world. And Augustine puts it this way, words have a meaning when a word refers to another word. And that's the literal sense when we read scripture, a word refers to a concept. But in the natural world, there are things that refer to other things. And so for the classic example is the pelican represents Christ on account of particular observed behaviors of the pelican. And so when we look at the book of nature, what we see reflected there are a set of truths that essentially mirror those that we find in scripture. And it's a very different conception of what emerges in the modern period, where in the book of nature you get, the omnipotence of God and that kind of stuff. Here, you get the Trinity is represented in the natural world. The incarnation is represented in the natural world. Christ's atoning death is represented in the natural world. And so the two books are read in this very close fashion, because the objects in the natural world have this emblematic representation capacity. And you'll find this story, Augustine says, a word refers to an object in scripture. In the world, objects refer to other objects. Aquinas will say the same thing, and you get what develops in the Middle Ages, a kind of fourfold tiered layers of understanding scripture and nature. Now, what happens in early modernity, the story is complicated, as they always are, but we get what C.S. Lewis beautifully describes as the discarded image, so that the image of the world is a kind of transparent means of seeing theological truths disappears, and the book of nature is rendered into another reductionistic language that Galileo famously says. It's written in the language of mathematics. But now the things in the natural world, they still have theological significance, but that theological significance is reduced to things like God's wisdom and power. And my argument would be part of what affects this change is a Protestant insistence on the primacy of the literal sense as opposed to the allegorical sense. And because allegory was essentially about the capacity of objects in the world to refer to other objects, once you do away with an allegorical interpretation, it has implications not merely for how we read scripture, but for how we read the natural world. So, and this then becomes, I think, the demise of allegory, as I say, what C.S. Lewis refers to as the discarded image then. It kind of reduces the channels to the transcendent in a quite significant way. So the book of nature takes on a completely different complexion post the demise of allegorical and emblematic and symbolic readings of the world. But it's those things that make a scientific approach to nature possible, where we now read nature as largely a utilitarian fashion. We attempt to establish our dominion over it. We make it do things for us. And so the use of nature transforms from being this theatre where we see these theological truths into something that we utilize and use for our own ends.
Yeah, I find that one of the things that your kind of your works have really helped with is seeing the eventual cost of Protestant iconoclasm when it goes to our relationship to nature, right? Like, I feel like Lynn White could update his article complaining about
Yeah.
Christianity with a lot of footnotes to you. And also what it's done to scripture. Now, this is me summarizing something you said to ask a question. So, feel free to tell me,
Sure.
no, not sure, Trip. But that Protestant return to the text without priestly mediation or the tradition and this kind of thing, that sets up this revolution of reading scripture where that centers both the individual interpreter, it centers the kind of literal reading of the text. And when that's carried over to nature, it's kind of like you talk about how the kind of Protestant feature a focus on the literal reading. The literalists love naturalism because the way we read the world is so similar to how the Protestant privileges reading scripture. And so that kind of reading, nature doesn't need to carry that allegorical or the surplus of meaning and that kind of thing. And so that same language that was used in the medieval context, where the book of nature could include like the vestige of the Trinity. If you think of like Augustine's, book on the Trinity, all of a sudden the book of nature is this model for extracting meaning and purpose from a created inert world that can be read literally.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly it. I mean, I think the other thing is that, reading scripture used to be, I mean, it was just, as you say, there was a communal element to it insofar as there was an authoritative interpretation, but it was also a form of spiritual practice. It wasn't a matter of deriving doctrinal content either, but it was really a matter of kind of, as I say, a spiritual practice. And I think certainly Protestant reformers retain elements of that, but there are, unintended consequences of this turn to the privacy of the individual as the side of the interpretation of the world and scripture.
So could you say a bit about I feel like you mentioned how the concept of religion is something we created and then creates this problem, right, of pluralism. And in Some New World, you spend some time looking at the genealogy in a sense of belief and how the concept of belief has changed over time. The emergence of supernaturalism that then renders the kind of account of naturalism we have at the same time. And you do something, a kind of genealogy around miracle as well. And I found all three of them important and helpful. But when you think of all three, like, which one do you think is important to kind of unpack first to see how they're layered? Because if you made a timeline, which I did, there's enough elements of each one that you kind of want to mention important parts at different places. So, so I'm interested in how, having spent so much time when you're trying to like explain the braided dance of sorts of these different themes, how you sort it.
Yeah, that's a good question, Trip. And one of the things when you're, as an author, it's not because these things are happening together. You've got to sort of put them in some kind of sequence, basically. And that sequence, to some extent, is an artificial one. And I think that there's a concatenation of belief and the miraculous and the supernatural that you can't actually untangle. And I think temporally one doesn't come first. So to give you an example, I mean, if we take a category belief, which now for us is a kind of epistemological category, it's to do with knowledge and, my sort of attitude to sort of propositions and truths out there in the world. But if you think of belief, if you think of, well, here again, if we go back to the Greek of the New Testament, pistis, there's a sense in which this is a divine gift, right? Faith is a gift. So it's not an epistemic category that me as a kind of autonomous rational individual make an explicit decision about. And this will later feed into notions of the ethics of belief, that I'm responsible for the things that I take on. So insofar as faith is classically a supernatural gift, you can see that there's already the element of the supernatural is present in our understandings of this category of faith. And so there's a kind of paradoxical capacity to this notion that, our beliefs are to some extent, if we accept this theological, our beliefs are not part of some naturalistic psychology that we can give an account of in purely naturalistic terms. So although the term supernatural is not present, insofar as faith is a gift, then already the supernatural is present there. It's not just this something that has the capacity to be subjected to a kind of neutral analysis. It's already a theological conception. Now, of course, that changes. By the time we get to the 18th and 19th centuries, we've got this notion of belief as something just do this analysis of. And part of that, I think, is to do with the linguistic transitions, that when we move from pistis in the Greek to credo in the Latin and fides, we've now got what used to be in the Greek a single term for faith and belief. We now have a conception of faith, fides, and belief. I believe, credo, etc. And there's no verb form of fides. And so I think already this problem of translation sets up the possibility of a distinction between faith as a theological category and belief as a kind of a more neutral epistemic. And so interestingly, we don't get this in the German, which still has all the Danish actually still have the same word for faith and belief. But anyway, so I think these linguistic transitions are interesting, but the secularization of belief is something that eventually happens in the early modern period. But sorry, to get back to your question. So I think you can choose any one of them. I think belief is tracing changing conceptions of belief and the terms that represent it are a way of shedding light on the miraculous. And I haven't talked about the miraculous, but just to give you one example, if you think about Augustine's conception of how we come to know things, we come to know things through divine illumination. And there's a sense in which every act of knowledge is a miraculous act in that context, that God illuminates the concept within our minds. And so once again, these notions of faith and belief, the miraculous and the supernatural are all tied in together. And part of my story is how these things come to be separated, teased out in early modernity. So belief completely changes its complexity.
Yeah, well, one of the elements in the story of belief that you tell that just, with the friends that happened to be around while I was reading it and talking about how much I enjoyed it, one of the things that was really helpful just in explaining it was how the medieval period's concept of implicit belief kind of formalized this sense in which the lay people, like the people that know the Latin to begin with, right, and such, were affirming these particular doctrines in the creed, even though they don't have intellectual comprehension. And if we look at people's historians, they were probably practicing and doing all sorts of things that would have been in conflict, right, with affirming these beliefs. But that concept of implicit belief plays a particular role to set up Protestantism and that move away from belief as kind of trust in contrast to assent.
Yeah, yeah. No, look, it's a really good point. So implicit belief in the sense of I'm not over all the details of this, and if you ask me for a specific justification, I can't give it to you. But I'm confident that there are people who could give it to you, you know, and that's my implicit belief. It's a trust in the magisterium of the church to have kind of got these things right. And Protestants are highly critical of this because they want to argue, and we can understand this, that people need to be able to give an account of what it is that they believe. That's a very modern view. But I think in all of this, what gets hidden and smuggled away is the fact that the vast majority of the things that we believe implicitly. Okay. And crucially, this is perhaps more true in the sciences than anywhere else. So if you ask me why I'm confident in vaccinations against COVID, I can't give you the physiology, but I'm confident enough in the community of experts who do know, who could do that. And it seems perfectly rational, if I may say so, for me to hold that belief in spite of the fact that in a sense it's an implicit and religious belief in the Middle Ages was of that kind. And to some extent, I think still is the case. I think if you ask the average Christian to give you an account of the Trinity and the relation of the persons and etc.,
Yeah.
I suspect they might struggle.
There's going to be more heretics than there are Orthodox.
Exactly. You would find them slipping into some version of one of the classic Trinitarian heresies, but does it matter? Well, no, I don't think it does, because there's a notion of the belief is, as it were, distributed communally, and I think that's why this note that implicit belief that the Protestants were very edgy about is a lot to be said for it. And in fact, the reality that many, if not most of the things we presently across the board, we believe on the basis of implicit.
Yeah, and so, like, in that context, when the Protestant reformers attack implicit belief, usually related to some, like, real pragmatic pastoral question in their given context, right? Where if you're like, "Look, well, you're not examining this. If you examined it, then you wouldn't be funding this bill, or you wouldn't be terrorizing these people, or you wouldn't be," and so the critique of implicit belief sets up where the believers to take this kind of full responsibility for their belief. But, like, at that point, what belief meant has kind of migrated from the trusting orientation of oneself to intellectual assent. And you talk about the way that entailed explicit belief, and this expectation of justification. And it's in that context, right, this shifting of what we mean by belief and it being true, where you find resonance of early Protestantism for connecting to the emergence of science.
Yeah, that's right. So part of the connection there is the fact that we reject these received traditions, is in a way that the operative category here. And the argument was that in the sciences too, we've received this tradition with what's essentially Aristotelian science. We can use our own experience and our own reason to question this long-standing tradition. And then that becomes a key premise for the legitimation of modern science. And we know one interesting category here is the notion of experience, or in the Latin, experimentum. And even before the Protestant Reformation, in Catholic thinkers like Gearson, we have an emphasis on what he called experimental religion, which is testing for yourself at a personal level, these religious truths. So it's not enough just to have some notional implicit or nod in the direction of the doctrines. You need to experience these things for yourself. And that was called experimental religion, where you tested in your own person the truths of these things. And then this becomes an important part of Protestant, but it's a very individual conception, but it then also maps across, and I would argue the very terminology of experimental science comes from this notion of experimental religion, where as an individual, you need to test for yourself the truths that you are laying claim to. And that's a key part of Protestantism and Puritanism. And that ethos then flows across into this notion of experimental science, where you subject authoritative claims to a test. But the rhetoric and the propaganda of that's kind of got away from us. So we seem to think that modern science is all about, well, individuals testing for themselves. Well, it's not. Again, you've got these massive trust networks involved. And if you don't trust the scientific colleagues, and there are problems with that, then science can't proceed at all. So it's really interesting striking a balance between notions of individual responsibility for what we hold to and trusting the deliverance of others. And, at the pinch point of things, as I just mentioned, sort of vaccine, for example, do you do your own research? Do your own research? Or do you trust, and so there's an argument going right back to the Enlightenment that you need to do your own research.
And one of the things that stuck out to me just in that notion of kind of experimental in the sense of one's belief. If we took experimental in belief and it was a practice, it would make sense, right? So if we think of Jesus in relationship to the disciples, right, they're experimenting in the truth of Jesus as the Christ by following him around and living him. Or the same's true with Buddha or any religious tradition. The epistemology is you have to actually join it, do it, and engage in it to know anything about it. And no one thought it was otherwise until we invented religion as a concept.
Yeah.
And then said, let's in order to be one, you have to really believe and articulate the doctrines with reason and your authority alone. And it's just fascinating to me that like the experiment that proves one's faith isn't learning to pray for your enemy till you learn to see them as God sees them. It's, well, how does the hypostatic union work out for the incarnation? And yes.
No, look, that's exactly right. And so, I mean, when you read the Puritan literature, these are spiritual practices. That's how they understand the experiment. And in a sense, the knowledge is not I won't say it's not distinguishable from the practice. It is distinguishable from the practice, but there is no such thing as a kind of neutral knowledge that's isolated from some particular set of experiences, and typically a community. And this is what Pascal says in the wage argument. You don't believe and you want to believe. What do you do? Well, you don't go to a natural theology textbook. So you participate in a religious community. You say the prayers, you say the masses, and this will induce you to believe. So bottom line is that belief occurs in a particular context of communal practice and experience. And that's as true for science as it is for religion.
One of the things that's different, right, if we go back in time, is it takes this migration of what the term belief means for then its counterpoint to be disbelief. Can you kind of like flip that story of belief on its head and kind of bring out the features that help explain where we get to a point where someone like Charles Taylor writes secular age is like 500 years ago you didn't have this debate, and so much of it's entailed in this the kind of dance of science and religion and their self-understandings.
Yeah. So I mean, so Taylor's thing is that Middle Ages, even early modern period, there wasn't a question of the existence of God. This was naturally assumed, and it wasn't. To put it another way, it wasn't that people had the option believe or not believe. It was just part of the air that people typically breathe. And this is why the very notion of an atheist was very difficult to conceptualize. But I think what changed that, what changed it, and let me just bracket that and say, I think this is true for most cultures, almost invariably. This is what anthropologists tell us as well, that this connection to the transcendent, the transcendent is a kind of natural thing. And Taylor would talk in this sense about porous selves, individuals are in a sense open to the influence of what we now call the supernatural. Now, where am I going? Where am I going with this? So part of what changes it's not that people's beliefs change, but we get a notion of belief itself that is the key thing that makes a difference. A notion of belief that this is something we make as an individual based on evidence. It's a commitment for which we need to have reasons. And what motivates that on my account is the fact that we now have plural religions in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. And so the question of the justification of, which creed that you adhere to can no longer simply be a matter of breathing in the air, but it now becomes a decision that you need to make. And it's a crucial decision because on the arguments floating around at the time, your eternal destiny depends on your being in the right one of these confessions. And so, this then, to go back to my original story, this then will later become a story about plural religions in the world and the problem of competing truth claims. But it originates in these post-Reformation debates about, well, I might be in a Catholic territory, given the Treaty of Westphalia, but I actually have the capacity to decide that I could be a Protestant if I wanted to. And that's a very new thing. And then the question is, well, what's the basis on which I made that decision? And then you get a series of rational arguments coming into play about why we should do this and that. And so post-Reformation controversy generates the conditions for thinking about belief as a voluntary thing for which you need to have reasons. And that then will give rise not merely to, the cross-confessional apologetics, but to a general natural theology that also provides a set of rational grounds for believing in Christianity, which, I've argued actually opens it up to rational critique. And that's the modern situation.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was really helpful in the way you narrate it is that, in a sense, modernity it begins with this notion of religion. Now there's a multiplicity of Christianities. They require this legitimation over against these other now live cultural options. And then you get to the point of encountering other religious traditions beyond Christianity as live options. But that Protestant notion of self-justification is still there. And then you get the ability to live a human life without reference to a confessional wisdom tradition. But like the framework of modernity has this kind of normative rationality is a Protestant passion. And it's just kind of fascinating. And one of the examples you gave in the book that I'd love for you to kind of talk about is just how, before any of this, you wouldn't have had natural theology, right? Like natural theology is a theology where you think the public square has some shared reference points that you don't have once you learn that real biblical Christianity is being a primitive Baptist. And I, grew up and I was supposed to pray for the Free Will Baptists across the street because those were the, let alone other religions like United Methodists. That's rural North Carolina for you. But you talk about how even, say, texts that everyone in Intro to Philosophy of Religion will read, like Anselm's proofs or Aquinas' proofs for the existence of God, they began as within a very different context of within a religious community, a form of a spiritual exercise, and then came to serve this other function, right, as this new Enlightenment logic comes on. So I'd love for you to kind of like help us think about just that shift of how the functions of God.
Part of our problem here is our, introduction to philosophy of religion and Christian apologetics more generally, which buy into the notion and completely understandably, we have to justify our beliefs and there's a capacity in rational justification. And look, I'm not criticizing that, but the contrast case is the pre-modern period. And our tendency is to project back our present conceptions of how these arguments function onto classical figures who, as you say, Anselm and Aquinas typically. And therefore, when you read in a philosophy of religion 101, Anselm gives us the ontological arguments, and then Descartes gives us the ontological argument, and then we see how, and then Kant critiques it and shows how it's false, as Kant does, arguably for the argument from design and so forth, and then the argument from contingents or whatever. But look, that's a mistake, I think. And Sewell, I think, is the most obvious case that if you look at the proslogion where he sets out the so-called ontological argument, it's clear that he's involved in a series of exercises, and the whole lead-up is setting out the conditions for the meditation on a God in whom we already believe. But, what can we discern it by meditating on the conception of this God in whom we already believe? And then and that's obvious. Interestingly, as again I say in the book, it's interesting that Descartes in the sixth meditation, or in the meditations generally, where he rehearses this so-called ontological arc, he also sets up conditions for meditation as well. That's why it's called the meditations, right? And so there's still, even in these modern articulations of the argument, there is still this element of spiritual exercises. I mean, just quickly to revert to Aquinas again, Aquinas' 5 ways, typically called 5 arguments for the existence of God. But if you look at the prelude to this, what Aquinas says is, what we learn from the Bible is that we can learn about God from nature. Now, let's see if that's right. Okay. And here we find in Aristotle these five what look like arguments. And then at the end of the so-called argument, Aquinas says, yeah, and this being said, we all believe to be God, right? So obviously these start from a faith commitment. They don't start from neutral grounds, which is the standard way natural theology is now described. And as I pointed out in the book, even the so-called arguments from design that we see articulated in the 17th century and 18th century, the period talking about design, in many of these books, in essence, what's going on is there's some contemplation of the natural world from which we then get some understanding of God, but it's not a process of rational deduction from premises. It's still very much in the business of spiritual exercises. And so our very conception of natural theology is something that can start from neutral grounds and build up a series of arguments. Is a modern invention that comes in the wake of this claim that we need to justify our beliefs on some putatively neutral, universally accepted territory. That notion itself, I think, is deeply problematic, because I don't think those premises exist.
Yeah, maybe here's a good time to talk about how this shift that you see, say, reading Anselm or Aquinas in after modernity versus in the context in which they arose. It might help to talk about the kind of natural supernaturalism distinction, how it emerges in the Middle Ages, and then how early modern notions of causation and biblical scholars really make a mess of things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so here's the bottom line. When we think about religion, we tend to think about religion entails belief in the supernatural. Now, we've done the belief story, and belief meant something very different in the past. And so supernatural, in fact, the giveaway for supernatural is the fact that we don't actually find the term in Latin until the 13th century. So if it's true that there are versions in Greek, like supernatural, so the Greek fathers would talk about hypothesis, which is really to do with human beings being raised to a state of participation in God. So there is some within that I think is the origin when it comes from the Greek. It moves across into the Latin. But here's the thing: Christians don't talk about the supernatural until the 13th century, so they can get away with their convictions without a conception that we now regard as kind of central to religion. Now, they do have a distinction between created and creation, creator and created and so on, but that doesn't match a segment. Anyway, so Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century starts to use the word supernatural, but he uses it for gifts God conveys upon us. It's not a distinct realm from the realm of the natural world. And so it doesn't map onto our two-tiered understanding of reality. So Catholic official documents don't talk about supernatural until the 16th century. You don't see a reference in papal encyclicals and so on until the 16th century. The term supernatural, something new, happens in the 13th century. It starts to take on its modern meaning in the 17th century. But what's interesting, I think, about the way in which pioneers of the scientific revolution, Descartes, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, talk about the supernatural is in this way, that the whole world is in a sense saturated with God and God's agency. And they don't buy into a natural supernatural distinction either, because cutting a long story short, God is doing all of the causal work and he's doing it direct. So again, simplifying things somewhat, if we ask for Newton, what's gravity, what's pulling these things together? It's God, right? And God's doing this. We call this activity laws of nature. So the whole world is thoroughly super God. And this is the dominant view of laws of nature going right into the 19th century. This is God's activity in the world. And what happens in the late 19th century is that naturalists like Thomas Henry Huxley just say, look at this conception of laws of nature and say, well, we'll have that for us. And so that the notion of God's activity simply is redescribed as regularities of nature, no longer require any explanation. So paradoxically, we this change of theological valence in the conception of laws of nature. And the supernatural in that context then is not the laws of nature, but everything outside that, which for naturalists is really nothing because it's beyond the boundaries of our scientific expertise and unnecessary in a way to account for the regularities of the natural world.
Yeah. So one of the things about this that I think might be important for people that haven't, read the whole book and got the big picture is that these kind of early, the flattening mode of that early modern period ends up flattening causation from the, at least the 5 types of causation or whatever version of the thicker account you have, so that then the divine actions won among other efficient causes in the world. And that's where, depending on what genealogy of modernity, you get like Scottish univocity of being makes God a being like other beings, allows for the predication of existence to God, which has some consequences. And so you have that kind of like trajectory in theological context. But like you hinted there at the end, this migration of the divine laws and divine agency and these kind of things into laws of nature, that you can then keep the laws of nature without the lawgiver, that ends up generating where this theological account of nature takes on a whole new function once the lawgiver's not there.
Yeah. So again, in a nutshell, so what modern science is predicated on, I think, is a dismissal of the medieval and Aristotelian conception of multi-layered causes. And God, in a sense, acts at every causal level. But there are different, things have, to some extent, they have their own inherent capacities to do things. God endowed them with, and when they exercise their own individual causality, God works along with that to make things happen. In the early modern period, when we get an atomistic conception of nature, what happens is that all of those causes, the layers of causes, the instrumental, the formal, the material, the final, they just disappear. And you've got this single kind of causation, which is essentially efficient causation under the old Aristotelian scheme, the thing that when one billiard ball hits the other one, it moves. That's efficient causation. So you have this reduction in the layers of causality And God is the only genuine efficient cause. And this doctrine occasionally is often associated with the French philosopher Malebranche, and it's said to be a solution to the mind body problem. That's not the story. The story is that everyone is running this line because the world is made up of inert particles that have no capacity to move themselves. Only God can move them, and God moves them according to laws that He's instantiated and stamped on. And that entails a radical collapse of as you say, of these multiple causes to a single layer of causality, which is, in the terminology we're familiar with, it's God doing the work. Newton, Boyle, Descartes are explicit about this. And this notion, as I've said, you've still got this theistic understanding of laws of nature persisting to the 19th century, but it's susceptible, as she says, susceptible to a hostile takeover, as it were, because you've just got this one layer of causes. And naturalists say, well, we're just going to relabel that not supernatural, but natural, right? And there's nothing left to explain after that, because of the divine monopoly of causation is now transferred to a form of naturalism. And so that's the story of how, a naturalistic account's possible, because it simply takes a supernatural understanding of a single layer of causality, redescribes it as naturalism, and then away we go with modern naturalism.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe you could take some time to talk about the role you see Hume playing in the kind of natural supernatural distinction, and then in the way his naturalism ends up framing conversations around the miraculous.
Yes, Hume does play an important role. Interestingly, Hume, if we think about the story of causality, the story goes, in the modern period, that early modern thinkers get rid of these layers of causality. They get rid of the final cause and the formal cause and the material cause, so that all you're left with is the efficient cause. And Hume actually does away with the efficient cause and says, actually, we've got no reason to think there are any causes out there at all. It's our psychological imposition on regularities of nature. So Hume has an alternative conception of what's going on there, but he can only get this up and running by doing away with causation altogether. So Hume is, in one sense, is the next logical step in this causal reductionism. And now, because if it's the case, as Hume says, that our attribution of causality is not actually describing, God's efficient causation, but it's a psychological imposition on the net. Well, then for Hume, Hume's well ahead of his time on this. You no longer have a reason to postulate God as doing that. Now, the other part of Hume, I think, is Hume on the miraculous. And Hume wants to say, well, okay, given this, what's our science based on? What are natural based on? Well, he says they're based on cumulative observations. And the reason we talk about laws of nature at all is that over the centuries, countless people have attested to the fact, for example, the sun rises every day. So we postulate that as a law of nature because it's consistent with our observations. If anyone were to say, well, here's one day when the sun didn't rise, Hume says, well, the reason we would dismiss that claim is that it's one testimony over against countless others. So the wise man, as it says, just weighs up the evidence and will dismiss claims to exceptions of nature. And this develops into Hume's argument against miracles. Now, what I think is the problem with the Humean argument is in fact that there's countless testimony to miracles going on in the world. It's interesting in this context. I don't know if you've come across Carlos Ayres' book, They Flew, which is about levitating saints. And it came out about the same time as my book. Fortunately, I wasn't able to take it into consideration. But what's remarkable about this book is that it shows just how strong the testimony was to these miraculous events in not merely the pre-modern, but the modern period. So Hume has a problem. And the problem is that actually there's a significant accumulated testimony to the miraculous as well. And what that would suggest is logically you accept that for the most part laws of nature hold, but there are exceptions that we call miracles. So Hume's faced with the fact that many places have testimony to the miraculous, and he has to dismiss it. And essentially his way of dismissing it is to say, these are the mark of primitive minds. And so we then get a progressive understanding of historical development that says anyone who tells you about some miraculous or unusual thing, they're likely to be untrustworthy, primitive person. And it's a mark of civilization that we dismiss these stories. And I think that in a sense has become, again, part of the story of modernity, where we have this cultural condescension to both our own historical predecessors who believed, for the most part, in the miraculous, and indeed many other cultures around that have testimony to, strange things going on. And the Humean story, which then gets, I think, built into Enlightenment histories, philosophy and religion, is that testimony to the miraculous is the mark of a primitive society, and that we've outgrown that. And you can dismiss these irrespective of how much testimony there is to them, because they're just coming from a primitive mindset we've grown. And so there's a story of human progress that gets built into his critique of miracles. It's not philosophical at all, but boils down to a kind of prejudice against the past and against other cultures.
One of the things that's fascinating about that is the way in which it's very similar to like Spivak's concept of worlding in post-colonial theory, where it's wording the world from the point of view of the master, right? And he gives this story of the British colonialist creates a map of India, but it's based on all the wisdom of the Indian guide. And once the knowledge is extracted from the native, it's then objectified from the colonialist perspective on a map, new names, lines, territories, these kinds of things. And then you go around and you're like, well, that's just what's there, right? And the assumption is there was this progress by giving it the order of, states and cities and good English names, and we're helping to help you understand your world. And it's that, it's the burden of nobilizing the savages, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things this intertwined history of religion and science really reveals is a way in which kind of that the iconoclastic energy of Protestantism dialed up with the kind of reductive tendency of scientism, like those are both stewards of colonialism, and religion and science have like a kindred hermeneutic that supports and legitimates progress narratives and domination and extraction.
Yeah, that's right. And it's partly, there's a number of elements to it, but, part of it, I think, is the demonization of Catholicism and superstition, and the necessity that the Reformation represent a historical state, right? And you see, it's very clear when you look at, say, Hegel's reading of the Protestant Reformation, where Hegel reads the Protestant Reformation in its assertion of individuality, in its rejection of what he perceives to be Catholic superstition as a stage in the evolution of human rationality and human freedom. And although, there aren't that many people who are signed up Hegelians because they've got no idea what he's talking about at the time. But this progressive narrative, we see it we also see it in the social sciences like Kant and early anthropologies, which is human development, which is stages away from superstition towards some advanced civilization. And then the civilizing mission of the West becomes part of this progressive story where we're rescuing people from their delusions by imposing our values and conceptions on them.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny because that kind of domination story that you could tell about the kind of epistemology that either religious or kind of like a scientism and such can play out. In many sense, modernity generated different variations of God-splainers in a sense. It's like mansplaining, but worse because it's about ultimate mystery. And then you get the world's most viewed religion and science debate between Bill Nye the Science Guy and the dude from the art museum, right? And both of them have like this strikingly similar epistemology with just very different a priori commitments. And no, no one will be able to hear the other one talk the entire time, right? And that was the most viewed religion science debate, was two people that came in utterly confident. So neither a life of faith or the inquiry of the scientific mind has generated an ounce of humanity in either one of them.
No, exactly right. And it's remarkable how these debates will often, they proceed on a set of underlying assumptions that are shared. And the problem is the assumptions. It's not the substance of the argument. Yeah.
Can you say a bit about that? The first use of natural supernatural in a modern way taking place in biblical studies, because it was one of those features that kind of stuck out to me in a rather profound way, that kind of drive for the historical critical method of thinking about the Bible became that dominant hermeneutic there, but then migrates to all these other places, and it's fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, and I think way back, sort of two moments in biblical hermeneutics that are key, and the emergence of German biblical criticism is one of them. But if we paint the general frame in the Victorian period, where there's a so-called crisis of faith, it's not generated by science. It's partly generated by questions of theodicy, I think. But biblical criticism is really what I think drives people to question their faith. And we see this in the fact that Darwin's Origin of Species comes out in 1859. The book Essays and Reviews comes out in 1860. And this Essays and Reviews presents to an English audience the results of German biblical criticism. That book outsells Darwin's by about a factor of 20 to 1. So this is really what gets people going. Now, to next part of the story is just Huxley talks about naturalism, and Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, famously, he's the guy who really introduces the notion of scientific naturalism to the West. Where does he get this expression naturalism from? Well, he actually gets it from the sphere of biblical criticism. And Huxley's reading up on these guys. He sees that biblical criticism was a kind of chink in the armor that he can exploit. But the original use of the term naturalism, or sometimes it was called rationalism, was an approach to the biblical texts that explained the miracles in naturalistic terms. So it wasn't skeptical about whether they took place, but it sought to give an account in purely naturalistic terms. And the people who were opposed to that hermeneutical approach were called the supernaturalists. And they argued that they agreed that the miracles had taken place, but they had a genuinely supernatural basis that couldn't be accounted for in purely naturalistic terms. And this is in German and subsequently in English, where we first get the isms, naturalism and supernaturalism. And as I said, Thomas Henry Huxley, who gets scientific naturalism off the ground in the late 19th century, is reading German biblical criticism. He writes his own biblical, he actually has essays on biblical criticism, doing source criticism of doing work on the Gospels. But so what does Huxley do? Huxley sees this distinction, thinks, that's really helpful. I'm going to bring that across, and I'm going to apply that conception right across the board. This naturalism, supernaturalism distinction as a way of carving up ontological territory. So he borrows it from German biblical criticism, uses it as a way of understanding the world, and then says, look, naturalism is the genuinely scientific approach. What's interesting, again, going back to the German biblical criticism is a type of science. It's part of Wissenschaft. And so Huxley is arguing that scientific naturalism, in this much broader sense than it's now become, is the way to approach the world. And he sees himself as having allies in the camp of the biblical critics who were adopting a naturalist approach. And so the sciences for him at this point encompass the science of biblical criticism. And so the sciences are then aligned against supernaturalist approaches, and then subsequent use of scientific naturalism. The broader context of Wissenschaft in German falls away, partly because it's in the 19th century that we get our own narrow conception of science. And so naturalism then becomes associated simply with the natural sciences, and argued to be both how we need to do them and to be justified by the results of the sciences themselves.
Yeah. In that period, in the 19th century and such, is also the time where the practice of methodological naturalism takes a kind of robustly metaphysical form, even if even if it's not an articulated metaphysic, it's a kind of an a priori one. And I want, like, do you think that that transformation of naturalism from a methodological commitment to then kind of a assumed metaphysical one, what role do you see that playing in the or the way, especially when it connects to a natural supernatural distinction in scripture for generating the kind of anti-intellectualism or this experience of threat of science in so many Christians?
Yeah, look, so let's take methodological naturalism for a start. It's interesting that the term methodological naturalism is not in use until it's mentioned. Its first use is in the late 1920s when a guy called Edgar Brightman, a Christian philosopher, uses it. It's not adopted in any significant sense. It's reinvented by another Christian thinker, I think in the 1960s, methodological naturalism. And the context there, I think, is a way for Christian scientists to kind of bracket out ontological naturalism so that they can still participate in the activity of doing science by saying, well, I'm adopting a methodological stance in this, but it's not an ontological claim. So I think the methodological naturalism, which is to say, for the purposes of doing science, I'm going to exclude God type explanations. That formal categorization appears much later than the 19th century. Although, we can go right back to the Middle Ages and Albert the Great in the 13th century and his colleagues. You say, well, when we do natural philosophy, it's like we disregard miracles. So there's already a sense in which, and even Newton's contemporaries would say, well, we're doing science. We're doing what normally happens. And in that sense, we're going to exclude the miraculous. So for practical purposes, there was always a sense that this was it. Although, again, for people like Newton, God was still there doing, in a sense, everything was still miraculous. So I think what happens is that from the late 19th century on, the assumption is that we exclude God from our scientific explanations. And the success of our scientific explanations justifies the assumption of naturalism. And so there's a subtle equivocation between the methodological approach and its ontological implications, which are seen to be naturalist. And that's why, as I said, it's a tendency now, I think, for naturalists to see science as in some sense vindicating the naturalist approach, where in my view, it's actually vindicating just kind of deism or theism that invokes regularities.
What are the future trajectories you think are possible if more of those invested in the religion science dialogue, or just religion and scholars in general and scientists in general, like if we have a better understanding of the history, how do you think it could open up different kind of trajectories within the field?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And I get get this one a lot, and it's, so do we give up on methodological naturalism, for example? Is there some kind of theistic science? Um, so I think science is fine as it is, right? I think one of the main implications of this is that naturalism is not indicated by science. And naturalism, people who claim to be naturalists are just flag waving. They're not, naturalism is not based on any set of scientific justifications. And there's no reason why what we regard as naturalistic science can't be given a theological gloss. So I think that's, so don't believe it. Don't believe naturalists when they tell you that their position is somehow vindicated by the success of the sciences. I think what the success of the sciences arguably vindicates is something like an old theological conception of laws of nature. That if you want to push it that way. So what else can we say? For me, it's partly about putting science into its context, and what the long history of our engagements with the natural world suggests is that the highly specialized and reductionistic approaches of modern science are fantastic for giving us certain capacities. But it's a very impoverished picture of the natural world. And in order to get a more robust conception of what's going on in nature, we need to give up on the idea that science is the authority for that. It's not. And we can see this if we look at other cultural traditions where they have very different conceptions of nature, more capacious conceptions of nature. If we look at our own parts, for example, the symbolic emblematic rhythms, I'm not sure we can get those back. But what they suggest is that the historical circumstances in which we now find ourselves in, that our conceptions of nature are really very, very sclerotic and limited. And although science, this is not a criticism of science. Science is doing fantastic things. Let's be clear about. But as an overarching vision of nature, it's incomplete, and perhaps to some extent, it's even misleading.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of the line from Arthur Eddington where he talks about the modernity basically abridged the book of nature and then walked around like they had the whole thing figured out. And it's like, well, no, there are all these elements of our experience that aren't in it. And it's not science's problem that something like the first person experience of consciousness or a grounding for ethics and values, or, these real realities in they aren't contained within an access to the scientific method is not a denial that they exist in reality. And you can say that while also going, yeah. And when we ask a scientific question, we actually have honed a method for figuring it out and through a group of inquiry and asking questions, developing hypothesis, interpreting it through theories, and then falsifying it and building again. At least I have had this experience when coaching kids sports teams, where when everyone wants to be the quarterback on the football team, the American football team, then the team just does really poorly. And and they all are just waiting for their one turn to be the one with the ball. And so at some point you got to go, no, I need 4 of you to really be invested in blocking. And if y'all get into blocking, everyone else, we're going to win. Like, this is how you're going to win. You're playing other 8-year-olds. Block. But it's like, if you need them to answer every question, asking a scientist who put where'd the fire in the equations go? Or what happened before, a quantum fluctuation of vacuum in T1, or you ask a metaphysical or philosophical question and you're going to get a bad answer, but it's not because the science is bad. It's because the science has limits. Right. And I just think that's it. So there were 3 movements that are that are current, that I'm interested in how you see this history stuff connecting to, and you could pick whichever ones you want to talk about. But, so like when you think of in philosophy of science, someone like Nancy Cartwright's work and thinking about methods, or within philosophers and philosophers of religion engaging science, between like David Bentley Hart to someone like Keith Ward, or those of us that are more process types and everything, there's been a resurgence of dual aspect monism, or within the UK, in Australia, there are more philosophers that are doing expansive naturalism, right? And trying to, where in all these ways you could see your historical account actually helping change, like, a way you think about philosophy of science, the way you think about the God world relation, or the way in which you understand naturalism. And I'm wondering what it feels like, just because I know people in all three of those camps that love your books and go,
Well, that's
"Oh, this is so helpful."
that's good to know. Yeah. Well, look, I mean, yeah, I know Nancy Cartwright and Keith Ward, and we've had conversations about these, but partly about laws of nature. I mean, I find Nancy's both the work of both Nancy and Keith really very interesting. And Nancy Cartwright's sort of argument about laws of nature that, well, actually there is no such thing, and you've got this dappled world, as she puts it. And I think there's certainly something to be said from that, from the perspective of the scientists themselves. So, one of the distinctive things about Nancy's is that she's well clued up, really well clued up on the sciences, and a very impressive philosopher as well. And that's a great combination. And what I like about Keith Ward's stuff is that, he's kind of running an idealist philosophy, which again I think is really very interesting in the contemporary context. And the history of philosophy, a great story about the history of philosophy is philosophy never really refuted idealism. It just stepped around it and kept going. And 19th century idealism in England, I think, was a really very interesting. So David Bentley Hart's stuff, I think, is terrific. The recent book on the philosophy of mind, where he just really exposes the kind of misplaced confidence of reductionistic accounts of the human mind that, really can't seem to find a place for human consciousness in the natural world. That's important. But if you've got a version of nature that can't accommodate, you've got a pretty impoverished conception of what's going on. And yes, expansive naturalism. There's the problem with the term naturalism is that it's so ambiguous and ambivalent, and there's so many different versions of it. But everyone wants to be ones, and this is why we've got so many different versions of it. And because the alternative looks like there's some kind of supernaturalist. No one wants to be that. And so everyone wants to sign up to some version of naturalism. But as you say, there are some, I think subjective naturalism is, I think, a very entirely legitimate position, but it's not a position that rules out the existence of the supernatural. So just a quick off the top of my head response to those.
So what's the, when you use the word supernatural now, how do you, and knowing the whole history of its use, what do you think it's referring to in, say, in a religion science conversation, not, maybe outside, but when you think of how your peers, if they approach using it or making a reference to the supernatural, what's entailed in choosing to use that word?
Yeah, look, that's a good question, Trip. And look, I think this applies to, I've done conceptual histories on science and religion, supernatural, probably a few others in there. Yeah. And the question is, well, what do you do with these terms now? Can you still use them? Well, I think if you're going to have a conversation with people, you've got to use the language that they're operating with. And people use supernatural in a particular way. And I think you've got to start the conversation with the recognized terminology. But ultimately, I think you've got to use it in a critical fashion as well. So I think we all understand what people mean when they talk about the supernatural. But the question is, what assumptions about some ontological division this ultimately entails? And I think that really it's not an expression that you can deploy it in a very precise fashion if you're developing some kind of argument. And that would mean in the science of education. Sure, if I have a conversation with someone, we talk about supernatural, I think we both have a pretty good understanding of what the other person means. But once you start to get into an argument about or developing some kind of case, then it becomes problematic if you use it as uncritical because it's smuggled in certain assumptions that I think you need to be questioned.
One of the areas that science and religion dialogue has gone on the longest with lots of funding and had lots of creative responses is the divine action debate.
Yeah.
And something that stuck out to me showing up in it after spending a number of years where most of my research and stuff was on the science side is half of the people in the divine action debate would not mind using a phrase like supernatural, even though they're giving a natural how a methodologically natural you don't aren't having a violation of nature to then do what would normally be right in common use language supernatural events. Others will not use supernatural because of theological reasons, say Jürgen Moltmann in the Problem of Evil or Philip Clayton Divine Action and the Problem of Evil. It's so like it's a theodicy reason that they don't use the phrase supernatural
Yeah.
because it in that theological context, it's a referent to potential divine actions for good that were opted out on or permitted or whatever. And then there are those, say, someone like Wesley Wildman and who the question of naturalism and thinking about divine action, it's like, well, if you're not if you aren't going to be a naturalist of some sort, then you have theological problems, yes, which which Phil does, but he's like, but you also just have a lot of other ones too, and why not just take it all? Like, and I've been present where a middle position, he just terrorizes me, and he's one of the most scary people to have harassing you at AAR, and so and I can see how all these projects are usually engaging maybe in a different scientific field. So some are thinking about quantum mechanics and relativity things and physics, and some are thinking about biology or cognitive science, and some are thinking about the role and function of culture. And yet the theological question, supernatural, whether you use it, how do you use it, has all these different dialogue partners. And I wonder if there's anything you've learned at looking at the history of how it's played out in all these different places, where if theologians thought, when you're using this word, here's a few rules from Pete that'll help us like learn to communicate or at least name why our commitments are as such.
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. I mean, let me say two things. First of all, I think in the sociology of the science and religion field, there are certain labels that attract funding, right? And I'm not being critical in this respect, but certain labels get mileage because they're funded, and so there's a kind of sociology to things having this, the life course of particular conceptions and approaches. And Divine Action Project, I think, is one of those. And I'm not let me be very clear, I'm not wanting to denigrate the work that's gone on in that, because it brought together, lots of really, really great thinkers in the field. But again, this is for me at least, it's a field where you need to interrogate basic conceptions in which it's formulated. And divine action only becomes a problem after we get this modern conception of a causally closed universe. And then where does God get a look in? But the problem is to do with our conceptions of natural causation. It's not. So the solution to how God can act in the world is not to work within the frameworks that generate the problem, but to question how we got this problem from the frameworks themselves. And as I say, is divine action a problem for Thomas Aquinas? Well, no, it's not, because he's got this rich conception of causation. And my suggestion is not, the solution to the problem of divine action is to all become Thomists again. And that's nuts. But
there's funding for that.
If they're I'm on board, right? So there are fads and fashions in every field. But that's just a fact of how it works. And divine action was one of those. I just wonder whether closer interrogation of the categories in which the problem was expressed in the first place is the place to look at how the conundrum arises. But, going right back to what I said at the beginning, in a sense, that's my general approach to all of these problems, which in a sense, it relates to what we might call a subjective naturalism, which is to say that, sometimes the conundrums that we face are not actually out there in the world, but they're to do with how we conceptualize things. And if we look at our concepts, that actually provides the solution to the problem. That's a kind of Wittgensteinian approach, which I think is the right one to adopt. No, not everyone's going to agree with this.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to say, look, I think that Divine Action Project is a waste of time, partly because it was generated out of genuine concerns that people had and problems that they had. And I think I'm all for people working through their intellectual problems. But the way I would have worked through that was to look at the terms in which it was expressed in the first place, which I think is where the smoking gun is.
Mm-hmm. What's there's a similar thing, right? That Wittgensteinian move there is also similar patterns work through in anthropology and contemporary anthropology, where you go back, right? The ontological turn in anthropology involved people going back, looking at all the data we have on these different groups, and then doing follow-up research. Where if you don't come and assume the finality of your kind of materialist ontology, all of a sudden, right? Like the forest talk. There's all these kind of features, which are, similar to the levitating book you mentioned, or the problem with Hume's argument is there's quite a bit of, there are quite a bit of shared experiences and people testifying to this experience in reality or whatnot, where, here there's whole tribes have a very different relationship to the world because their way of being isn't oriented by the way culture and our technology and our attention forms, all the way down to, discovering that we don't know what it would be like to be in the world and not be literate, and just learning to read transforms how our primary visual field changes. We can't walk in the forest how humans did for most of human history once you're literate. And that's just wild, right? To then go, yeah, but let me tell you what's really happening.
No, look, I agree. And what, I think one of the difficulties we face in modern academia is the fact that it's very difficult for different disciplines to get together and talk, right? And so people to get anthropologists talking to historians of science, very rare, but these sorts of crossovers are the kinds of things that you only get to encounter when you really look at what's going on in other disciplinary areas.
So I had two other little questions, and one is about Boltzmann.
Mm-hmm.
And you've talked about him in a couple of your books, and I mean, I had a long relationship with Boltzmann because my dad was a minister, and I asked questions in high school, and he handed me books. So,
Wow.
When everyone else was listening to grunge music and wearing black, I did it and read existentialists.
Right.
So I've had a long relationship with him, but it was real different to talk about how Boltzmann's kind of project of demythologizing is actually helpful for thinking about the problems we face about these modern myths and such.
Yeah.
So knowing how many people hear the phrase demythologizing and think, oh no, here we go. Someone's about to ruin a good quality doctrine here, Peter.
Yeah.
What are the kind of techno liturgies of sorts that, if we take Boltzmann's demythologizing project seriously, can actually help thinking about the nature of faith in a modern context?
Yeah. Look, so, I'm a great admirer of Bolton. I think he was a very fine biblical scholar. One of the first to understand the significance of the eschatological elements in the Gospels. And I'm not sure I gave a lot, I'm not sure I buy into the whole demythologization package. I think the important element of that story is the fact that we lived in a mythological world as well. And just as the New Testament have a particular mythology, we also have a mythology. And that mythology is essentially a scientific worldview. And it's inculcated as you've indicated, and I think it's at least implicit in Bultmann. It's our very ways of being. I mean, you used the example of literacy, our interactions with our phones and computers and so on, form us in particular ways. And, Bultmann used the example of the phone and so on. That phone. But look, I think he's exactly right about the way in which we are formed by technology. And we have, Heidegger says this, of course, these are professional words, and Baldwin is seriously influenced by Heidegger. But, even Pope Francis in Laudato Si talks about all the influence of technology. Jacques Ellul is another one. So I think if you put all of these things together, what Bultmann's suggesting is that we know less than our New Testament counterparts are immersed in a particular mythology. And the question that and Bultmann poses acutely then is, what non-mythological kernel of Christianity is, how do you get to that? And I think that's a rather difficult problem because, here again, I think that the Pascalian point, which I think we see also reiterated in J.V. Smith's work on cultural liturgies and Bill Kavanaugh's work on that, is that, being part of a religious community is a way to shape and form experiences in ways that might counter aspects of a broader mythological framework in which we find ourselves embedded. But I think the acute question that Bultmann poses to us is, what's all the mythology's gone, what's left, and for him, it's kind of some existential encounter. Again, I'm not entirely convinced by that. And the danger of simply talking about various mythologies is that of getting into a kind of a relativism from which there's no return. And I want to resist that possibility too. I think there's a reality out there that we can have access to independent of the various mythological frameworks. So it's not mythology all the way down.
It's just, one of the things that you emphasized in the section about him is that, and this isn't often mentioned by theologians, and it's something I've talked with a number of Bultmann scholars about it, is when he talks about modernity and our world being different, he's not telling quantum physics, or he doesn't say the theory of evolution. He's like, we got a light bulb, we have a phone, right? Like a microwave. You could go through our modern world and how it shapes us, right? And so that, like, with the form of life and the way in the way we engage the world using our technology, we create technology recreates us, and it's all bound in a shared cultural framework and narrative of assumptions. And in the recognition that, like, the Christ event demythologizes the dominant structure, narrative, and assumptions in Jesus' own history, and has throughout the history of the church, and should do it to our own, right? So one of the gifts Bultmann does that not all liberal theologians do is he recognizes that the modern context in which we speak to and take the question seriously and all these kinds of things is to another mythology that has to be revealed as idolatrous when it claims us more than our allegiance at the existential level for Bultmann, but for others at other levels, right, to God. And I think that like, taking that insight, it's easy to see how this large story you tell about religion and science and their relationship for a Bultmannian or a Christian that wants to demythologize that finality, it turns that narrative into something that, Foucault or Nietzsche could have done,
Yeah.
and that's why I think it's really cool.
Well, yeah, thanks. No. And look, I think the other aspect of Bultmann is the notion of a scandal that Christianity is a scandal in its original context, and to some extent, it should be a scandal to today. So the movement offers resources for a kind of resistance to the your kind of dominant cultural paradigms, I think. Yeah.
So the last question I have is one about one that has shown up recently in the science and religion, different science and religion groups at AAR, the guild meetings, at regular thing in in the science and religion seminar at Edinburgh, and all the groups that were part of the God in the Book of Nature one, and it's trying to name the way in which uh, science and religion methodology is changing. If we think of the previous generation as something like the Divine Action Project, and maybe the one before that, the first generation or two of the field from like someone like Ponnenberg, or or developing typologies and putting people in it and these kind of things. It seems to me that like in the present there are these different options, and I wonder what you think the history side contributes to them. Right. So there are some that say, okay, well, let's think about, they try to narrow the question to a puzzle, using like the whole puzzle image. But one of the things that consistently ran into in developing these kind of puzzles for science engaged theology is there's nothing the scientist can say or bring that ultimately demands the theologian change their mind about anything, right? So it might help you decide how do you distribute the Eucharist, but there's nothing a scientist could say that could tell you anything about the reality of the Eucharist. Or there's nothing an anthropologist or cognitive scientists say about, answering the question of Christology, or thinking about cosmology or divine action. So, they're in some sense they narrow the question to go like, here's a puzzle and here's a narrow thing that like will answer this part of our question better if we do it if we engage science. But then your metaphysics, your entire systematic theology, and you basically you're asking for a good footnote from a scientist, but there's nothing I could tell you that would change what it means to say God created the world, you know? And then there are those who do take that, but then they tend to have some attachment to naturalism of some sort, right? So, you might there are variations of, like, Christian naturalism or expansive naturalism or all these kind of things that are thinking like, "No, science does create," they may not it may not define where our theology has to end here within, but our theology should cohere with the best account of that we can give to science. And that creative constructive project could mean you walk in a devout Lutheran and leave a Thomist because that's the only way you can retrieve X, Y, and Z. Or you're like, let's get rid of creation ex nihilo. Let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of this. Let's think about this. And I'm working on my Christology, but I might die first. Right. So I wonder how the history, which they both those models seem to respond to. Right. One, let's squeeze as much as we can into a normative naturalism of the present and engage science and never have to make our scientist friends uncomfortable other than that we prayed when they weren't around. Or let's engage science, but let's just frame it where our theology is not going to be problematized. And these are caricatures of friends who've all been on the podcast. So, but I'm really interested in how you see history, what it would do for kind of those two different intuitions.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a good question, Trips. Look, my overall approach to the science religion field is let 1,000 flowers bloom. And this is partly because different people are at different places, and some people need answers in a certain register, and some people need answers in another register. And it depends. So what we're starting from, what the commitments are. And so there are different approaches that are going to work in those different contexts. And I think I'm a great admirer of the pioneers of the field, although the field has moved on. So there's lots of really important work that's happened that's led up to the present moment. And, what can history offer? So I understand the logic of science-engaged theology, which explicitly says, well, if science is just this artificial aggregation of various activities, which is an implication of the historical analysis of our modern science, then we do the micro questions. And I can see the logic of that, but is, I think in science engaged theology, there was a kind of explicit rejection of attempting to do the big picture metaphysics. And I just don't think you can do that because that actually provides any particular scientific discovery, breakthrough, whatever, has ultimately rests on a set of metaphysical presuppositions. And so you actually need a hermeneutics of science before you can actually start to put those bits together. So while I understand the logic of the dealing with the small, and I think there are some really interesting things that come out of it, I don't think you can do that by just ignoring the bigger metaphysical picture. Now, okay, now who else is on board? I think so. If we think about responses to the historical approach, so science engaged theology is one. The After Science and Religion project was another one that got some of the radical orthodoxy gang involved. And I think there's some interesting work going on there that is not. Let me backtrack a second. So you gave the example of, we've got this theological conception, but it's completely immune to any potential change on the basis of a scientific claim, which seems to make sense to me. But the problem there is it looks like you say it's unfalsifiable. Going back to the old positivists, you have to ask if the beliefs you have make no difference to how the world actually is. And I'm not unsympathetic with that criticism. But to come back, I think one of the characteristics of the field is being given the cultural status of science is an unwillingness to take science on. And the worry is that to challenge any aspect of the science is to revisit the old conflict thing and to place yourself on the side of religious fundamentalists who have this religiously motivated opposition to science. So I suppose looking, what I think about the history is that it does afford opportunities for some pushback about science as an overarching explanatory framework that can do it all for us. And it shows us partial nature. It shows us its contingent nature. It shows us the mistakes it made. It shows us some of the blind alleys it went down. So a historical approach to science turns it into a more human enterprise and a more fallible enterprise. And I think that gives more space for, theological reflection and the legitimacy. It's the legitimacy of doing theological work, just as the legitimacy of the humanities overall, I think, is cast into question partly by the great successes of modern science. So what I hope is that history humanizes science in such a way that we don't worship in kind of an idolatrous fashion. And again, I'm not suggesting we be anti-science or oppose science, but we understand it has limitations and fallibilities. And I haven't seen a lot of that in the science religion field. That as I say, there's been you're right to say that it attempts to insulate important theological claims from the science. But by the same token, I think there hasn't been a prophetic reaction to scientism to the extent that there might have been, out of a fear, I think, of being labelled, by fundamentalists who's just opposed to science. And so I hope history gives us a kind of neutral place from which we can kind of look objectively and get a realistic conception of what science can actually deliver to us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. It's always hard interviewing someone the first time when you've read 5 of their books, and I had written up like 15 questions for each of the books, which it was mostly just to make sure it was all in my head, but then I just start talking. So I find the more excited I am for the interview, the harder it is for me to stay in something sequential, because I put my imaginary version of you in my head, and then you just happen to show up. So
I fall well short of the expectations.
No, I mean, you even have your cool accent for us Americans. That
right, yeah. Well, I'm glad that it's cool. I'm glad it's cool. It's been great talking, Trip. And you've made me sort of think through a few issues and, trying to think through the implications of this work is the hard. There's more to be done there, but it's been good chatting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, what are you working on now then? After you put out a big book like that, like,
Yeah.
does it turn into the moment you get the same question 9 times from peers, you're like, "Oh," or are you just wanting to take a nap and play with, grandkids or
Yeah, well, I don't have any grandkids yet, but I certainly I feel like taking a nap. Now I'm thinking of I've got a couple of ideas. One is on a book called what I call the shape of history, which is notions of directionality in history, and there's history going in it. And it comes out of the work in the previous book on progress,
Mhm.
and how conceptions of progress really look like secularized eschatological ideas. So I'm thinking about a book that deals with history and why we think history might be going somewhere and how history gives us meaning. So,
Mhm.
but I haven't started yet. But that's the plan at the moment.
Alright. Well, I'll look forward to it, and, hopefully it doesn't come out the same week as another last book from Charles
Charles
Taylor,
Taylor,
because
yeah.
it was, like, within the same week, both of your books showed up, and I was like, "Well, this is really gonna really cut into my sleep." I I don't want a friend to finish it first and start messaging me. It's
And Charles Taylor doesn't seem to know how to write a short book, right? It's
no, no. I think the only way you can do a short one is if it's, he's giving a lecture series, and he only has 4 hours of lectures,
yeah,
and then they
right.
turn it into a book
Well,
otherwise.
yeah. No, it's a great book. I'm not wanting to be critical. It's like all of this stuff. I'm a big fan of his work. So
Yeah. I was talking, do you know Jason Storm? Jason Adonda Storm.
I've never met him, but I know his work. Yeah, yeah,
He wrote The Myth of Disenchantment,
yeah,
his
yeah.
newest book on metamodernism, but we were talking and anyway, he said really nice stuff about you. He's like, "Well, have you read Peter Harrison?" I was like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah," and it turned into a whole side project, because he has this whole bit on kind of in metamodernism about the the kind of futility of the different versions of, like, critical postmodern turns, and he said there's a certain art of reading a genealogy that ends with openings, and then he referenced yours as one that he just really appreciated, and I was like, "Oh," but I hadn't talked to you then, but I was like, "I
Well,
love his
right.
book."
Well, that's nice. Well, his own work's actually very fruitful as well. I think so.
Mhm. Yeah, when half the people that, if the number of people at a séance that then get footnoted by a new atheist to explain that religion is stupid is just its own.
Yeah. No, I found that really his stuff in the stuff on Weber actually in the myth of disenchantment. Very yeah,
Mhm.
something I hadn't had realized. So
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm gonna go to sleep, it's late here, but,
okay, well, it's lunchtime for me, so
alrighty. It was great to meet you, and, hopefully, we'll end up running into each other in person at some point.
that'd be great. Yeah, okay. Thanks for the chat.
Alrighty.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.